They laughed at him for paying $100 for a horse that could barely stand. But days later, when they saw the animal save his new owner, everyone fell silent. Jamal Williams woke before dawn, the rusty springs of his narrow bed frame creaking in protest as he sat up. Through the patched curtain hanging over his window, the Kentucky sky was still dark, stars fading as the earth reluctantly turned toward morning. He reached for his threadbare jeans and pulled them over his lanky frame, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who learned early that making noise could bring unwanted attention. The floorboards whispered beneath his bare feet as he crossed to the small kitchenette that occupied one corner of the single-room rental. There, on the highest shelf, sat a dented coffee can, inconspicuous enough that a casual burglar might overlook it, but positioned so Jamal could see at a glance if it had been disturbed. He reached for it now, removing the plastic lid with reverent care. Inside lay his future, $427 in worn bills, meticulously smoothed and stacked, accumulated over 3 years of back-breaking labor. He counted them again, though he knew the sum by heart. Each bill represented hours stooped over fields, mending fences, mucking stalls, working for people who valued his unusual gift with animals, but rarely looked him in the eye. 3 more years, he whispered to himself, replacing the lid. Maybe 4. He knew the math was probably wishful thinking. A decent plot of land, even in this economically depressed corner of Kentucky, would cost thousands. But the dream sustained him. A sanctuary for abandoned and abused animals, a place where creatures could heal at their own pace, without whips or chains or impatient handlers. As he prepared for the day, splashing cold water on his face, chewing a piece of toast, Jamal's eyes drifted to the battered guitar case propped in the corner. The instrument inside was his most valuable possession, though its monetary worth was negligible. His mind wandered back 7 years, to when he was 14 and living in his 8th foster home. Robert Johnson had been different from the others. An elderly black blues musician who had toured the South in his youth, Robert had taken in foster children for decades. His small house had been filled with books, records, and instruments that he encouraged the children to explore. When he caught Jamal tentatively plucking at an old guitar, rather than scolding him for touching his things, Robert had pulled up a chair. "Blues ain't something you learn from books, son," he'd said, his fingers gnarled with arthritis, demonstrating a simple chord progression. "It's something you feel from living, and seems to me you've lived enough already to understand." For 2 precious years, Jamal had absorbed everything Robert could teach him, not just about music, but about dignity in a world designed to strip it away. Then one morning, Robert hadn't come down for breakfast. The heart attack had been swift and merciful, the social workers said. Before they moved Jamal to his next placement, Robert's daughter had pressed the old guitar into his hands. "Daddy would want you to have this," she'd said. "He told me once you had the touch." The memory faded as a truck horn blared outside, yanking Jamal back to the present. He needed to hurry. The job at Ashford Ranch wouldn't wait, and Douglas Ashford wasn't known for patience or second chances. 40 minutes later, Jamal pedaled his second-hand bicycle through the ornate iron gates of the largest property in Oak Ridge County. The Ashford family had made their fortune in coal 3 generations ago, and had since diversified into thoroughbred horses and real estate. The main house sat on a gentle rise, its white columns and sprawling wings deliberately reminiscent of antebellum plantation homes, a fantasy of genteel Southern aristocracy that conveniently omitted certain historical realities. Jamal steered well clear of the main house, heading instead for the caretaker's office near the equipment barn. The ranch foreman, a weathered man named Garrett, barely looked up from his clipboard as Jamal entered. "Southwest fence line needs repair. Posts are rotting out. Tools are in the shed. Materials on the back of the blue truck. Don't waste time." Jamal nodded, knowing better than to ask questions. As he gathered supplies, he observed the workings of the estate with quiet attention. Ashford Ranch was immaculate on the surface, gleaming stables, manicured paddocks, employees in crisp uniforms. But Jamal had worked at enough farms to recognize the underlying tension, The stable hands moved too quickly, glancing over their shoulders too often. The horses in the show barns, though magnificent, had that particular tightness around their eyes that spoke of training methods that prioritized results over well-being. By mid-morning, Jamal was deep into the work, digging out rotted fence posts under the already punishing spring sun. The physical labor was familiar, almost meditative, allowing his mind to wander back to the sketches hidden under his mattress, detailed plans for his sanctuary, with paddocks designed for anxious animals, quiet spaces for the traumatized ones, and open areas where the confident could play. A sharp crack interrupted his thoughts, followed by an equine scream that raised the hair on Jamal's arms. The sound came from a low, windowless building set apart from the main stables, a structure the workers called the correction barn. Jamal had heard whispers about what happened there but had never been inside. Moving on instinct, he approached the building, stepping lightly. A small, dust-covered window was set high in the wall. Standing on tiptoe, Jamal peered through the grimy glass and felt his stomach clench. 3 men were inside. 2 ranch hands struggled to hold a magnificent black Mustang against a restraining wall. The horse was severely underweight, ribs clearly visible beneath a coat that should have been glossy, but was dull and patched with scars. Most disturbing were the fresh welts across its flanks, still weeping. The 3rd man was Douglas Ashford himself, his custom-made boots and tailored riding pants incongruous with the violence of his actions. In his hand was a training whip, and as Jamal watched, Ashford brought it down again across the Mustang's back. "This goddamn animal will learn who's boss or he'll go to the slaughterhouse," Ashford shouted, his face flushed with rage. 3 months and he still won't take a saddle. My reputation won't be ruined by one stubborn horse. The Mustang's eyes rolled white with terror, but something in its posture struck Jamal. Despite the pain, despite being outnumbered and restrained, there was a defiance in the way the animal held its head, a dignity that refused to be broken. Then, as if sensing Jamal's presence, the horse turned its head slightly, and their eyes met through the dirty glass. In that instant, Jamal was transported back to his first foster home, staring at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror after being beaten for wetting the bed, seeing the same raw fear, the same impotent rage, and beneath it all, the same stubborn kernel of self that refused to be extinguished. The Mustang stilled for a moment, its breathing still rapid, but its struggles momentarily ceased. Something passed between them, a recognition that transcended species. That night, Jamal couldn't sleep. The image of the Mustang's eyes haunted him. He'd seen animal abuse before. It was an unfortunate reality in the agricultural world. But something about this particular horse had lodged in his heart like a splinter. At dawn, he returned to Ashford Ranch, using the excuse of finishing the fence repair. He found Douglas Ashford in the main stable, supervising the training of a young thoroughbred. Jamal stood quietly until Ashford noticed him, then dropped his eyes as he'd learned to do when addressing white men with power. "Mr. Ashford," he said, keeping his voice measured, "I heard you have a horse that's giving you trouble. Maybe I could help." Ashford stared at him for a moment, then laughed, his stable manager joining in. "That black demon? Even the Mexican breakers couldn't do anything with him. What could a boy like you possibly do?" "I wouldn't charge anything, sir. Just let me try." Ashford studied Jamal with undisguised contempt, then a malicious smile spread across his face. "You know what? You can have him. For $100. That's what the slaughterhouse would pay for the carcass anyway." Jamal felt his blood turn cold. $100 was nearly a quarter of his savings. But the look in that horse's eyes. "I'll take him, sir." The men laughed even harder. "Thunder, that's his name," Ashford said, pocketing the money Jamal had counted out with trembling fingers. "Because he came in wild as a storm. But I think I'll call him Fool from now on, like the boy who wasted his money on him." When Jamal entered the correction barn alone, Thunder reared up on his hind legs, neighing threateningly. Rather than approach him, Jamal simply sat down on the floor a few yards away, took the guitar from his back, and began to gently pluck the strings. For hours, he just played, never looking directly at the animal, occasionally speaking in a low, monotone voice about nothing in particular: the weather, the trees outside, stories from his childhood. "The sky's clearing up," he murmured between songs. "Gonna be a beautiful sunset, I think. Robert, that was my foster dad, the good one. He used to say that music carries better in clear air. Something about sound waves. He knew about things like that. Used to read encyclopedias for fun." Thunder remained in the corner, ears flicking back and forth, nostrils flared, but the initial panic in his eyes had subsided to wariness. As the afternoon light began to fade, Jamal carefully set aside his guitar and slowly stood up. Thunder tensed immediately, but didn't charge. "I'm going to come back with a rope," Jamal said softly. "Not to hurt you. Just to get you out of here. You don't have to trust me yet. Just don't kill me. Okay?" When he returned with a lead rope, the horse still backed away and snorted, but didn't attack. And when Jamal finally began to walk slowly out of the barn, to his amazement, Thunder followed, maintaining a distance but following voluntarily, to the astonishment of the workers watching from afar. "This is just the beginning," Jamal murmured to the horse as they walked under Kentucky's reddening sky. "We both know what it's like to be broken. Maybe we can figure out together how to be whole again." "You just wasted your money, boy," Ashford shouted as Jamal led Thunder away from the property. "That demon will break your neck before dawn." Jamal didn't respond, but when Thunder softly nickered behind him, as if perfectly understanding the threat, the young man smiled for the first time that day, because he knew something the rich man would never comprehend. Sometimes, the most broken souls recognize each other in the dark. The journey back to Jamal's rented house stretched longer than the actual distance. Each step forward seemed to magnify the weight of what he'd done. Behind him, Thunder followed at a cautious distance, his hooves striking the gravel with hesitant precision, ears constantly swiveling to catch every sound. Occasionally, the horse would stop entirely, head raised high, nostrils flaring to assess some perceived threat, and Jamal would wait patiently, never tugging on the lead rope he'd looped loosely around his hand. The few people they passed on the outskirts of town stared openly. An elderly white woman watering her front garden dropped her hose when she saw them, her mouth forming a perfect O of astonishment. A group of farmhands loading feed at the agricultural supply store nudged each other and pointed. "That the demon horse from Ashford's?" one called out. "Boy, you better have good life insurance." Jamal kept his eyes forward, but he felt Thunder tense behind him, responding to the loud voice with a nervous sidestep. "It's okay," he murmured, not turning around. "They're just scared of what they don't understand." By the time they reached his small rental house on the edge of town, the sun had nearly set. The property was little more than a shack with a patch of overgrown yard behind it, surrounded by a sagging wire fence, hardly suitable for housing a half-wild Mustang. Thunder halted at the boundary, refusing to step forward even when Jamal entered the yard. "I know it's not much," Jamal said softly, meeting the horse's suspicious gaze, "but it's better than where you were." That night, after tethering Thunder to the sturdiest post he could find and providing water in an old wash basin, Jamal worked by lantern light, dismantling the dilapidated shed in his backyard. His landlord, Mr. Finch, hadn't maintained the property in years, and the shed was little more than rotting wood and rusted nails. Still, it provided materials to start what Jamal needed. He worked through the night, stopping only when his arms trembled too badly to hold a hammer. By dawn, he had constructed a crude three-sided shelter. It wouldn't win any architectural awards, but it would keep the worst of the weather off Thunder. As the first light broke over the Kentucky hills, Jamal surveyed his work, awareness of his own exhaustion finally settling into his bones. "Not exactly Ashford's stables," he muttered, collapsing onto an overturned bucket. From her porch across the narrow street, Mrs. Grayson, a perpetually displeased widow in her 70s, stood with arms crossed, her housecoat pulled tight against the morning chill. "That animal is going to kill you, boy," she called, her voice carrying easily in the still dawn air. "Saw what happened to Jim Lester's son when their stallion went crazy. Crushed his chest like an eggshell." Jamal nodded politely but didn't engage. He'd learned long ago that some people's minds were as immovable as mountains. Instead, he turned back to Thunder, who had spent the night alternating between nervous pacing and frozen vigilance. "Today's a new day," he said to the horse, not caring if Mrs. Grayson thought he was crazy for talking to an animal. "We're going to take it slow." As he watched Thunder tentatively investigate the boundaries of his new world, Jamal's mind drifted back to one of his rare good memories from childhood. He'd been about 12, newly placed with Robert Johnson after a particularly bad foster home. Unable to sleep from nightmares, he'd wandered into the living room to find Robert awake, playing his guitar in the dark. "Can't sleep, son?" Robert had asked, not stopping his gentle picking. Jamal had shaken his head, afraid to speak. "That's all right. Blues was made for sleepless nights." Robert had patted the space beside him. "You know why blues works, boy? It speaks to the hurt place inside. Doesn't try to fix it or cover it up. Just says, 'I see you there, pain,' and somehow that makes it less lonely." The memory gave Jamal an idea. Each morning before heading out to whatever odd job he could find that day, he began sitting near Thunder's makeshift shelter with his morning coffee, just talking quietly. He spoke about the weather, about the birds nesting in the oak tree, about his dreams for a sanctuary where animals could heal at their own pace. He never approached Thunder directly, never tried to touch him or force interaction. In the evenings, bone-tired from manual labor, he would sit in the same spot with his guitar, playing soft blues progressions as the Kentucky sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The local reaction to Jamal's new companion was predictably harsh. At the farmer's market, where he sometimes found day work unloading trucks, the whispers followed him like shadows. "Heard the black kid threw away his savings on Ashford's devil horse. Won't last a week. That animal broke Miguel Rodriguez's arm, and he's been breaking horses for 20 years. Some creatures just got the devil in their blood. Can't be saved." Worse was encountering Douglas Ashford himself at the feed store, where Jamal had gone to spend precious dollars on quality hay. The rich man was holding court among a group of local farmers, but stopped mid-sentence when he spotted Jamal. "Well, if it isn't our local horse whisperer," Ashford said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "How's that investment working out, boy? Managed to touch him yet without losing a finger?" His companions chuckled obligingly, watching Jamal with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "He's settling in, sir," Jamal replied quietly, eyes lowered, hating the automatic deference in his voice but knowing better than to show defiance. "Some animals are born too wild to be saved," Ashford continued, his voice carrying deliberately throughout the store. "Just like some people." The racial implication hung in the air, clear as a bell to everyone present. Jamal silently paid for the hay, more expensive than he could truly afford, and left without responding. That night, he ate only a slice of bread with peanut butter, having spent his food money on Thunder's needs. Watching the horse cautiously eat the fresh hay, maintaining a vigilant distance from where Jamal sat, he decided it was worth it. "At least one of us should have a decent meal," he told Thunder, who flicked an ear in his direction but continued eating, eyes never leaving Jamal. Days passed in this manner, with small, nearly imperceptible shifts in Thunder's behavior. The horse began eating while Jamal was still in the yard, rather than waiting until he went inside. He would sometimes stand at the far side of the enclosure when Jamal played guitar, head lowered slightly, listening. Then came the night that changed everything. Jamal had been asleep for barely an hour when the first thunderclap shook his small house. Spring storms in Kentucky could turn violent quickly, and this one had built from nothing to a full-fledged tempest in minutes. Rain hammered against the roof like thrown pebbles, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts. He sat up, instantly alert, hearing the panicked whinnying from the backyard. Pulling on boots and grabbing a flashlight, he rushed outside into the deluge. What he saw sent ice through his veins. Thunder was in a full-blown panic, rearing and striking at the improvised shelter with his front hooves. The structure was already beginning to splinter under the assault, and in the brief flashes of lightning, Jamal could see that the horse had already injured himself, a dark streak of blood visible on one shoulder where he'd caught himself on an exposed nail. Without thinking of his own safety, Jamal grabbed his guitar from inside and entered the enclosure. Thunder reared again at his approach, nearly striking him. "Easy," Jamal called over the storm, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony. "Easy, boy." He settled against the fence, as far from the panicking horse as the small enclosure allowed, and began to play, louder than he ever had before, fighting to be heard over the thunder. His fingers, cold and wet, slipped on the strings, but he played on, singing at the top of his lungs, old blues songs that Robert had taught him, songs about survival and pain and somehow finding beauty in both. For hours the torrent continued. Rain soaked through Jamal's clothes until he couldn't feel the difference between his skin and the fabric anymore. Thunder continued to pace and snort, but his violent striking gradually subsided as the music provided a counterpoint to the storm's chaos. Somewhere in the darkest hours, exhaustion claimed Jamal. His fingers stilled on the strings, his voice gave out, and despite his best efforts, he slumped against the fence post and surrendered to sleep. He awoke to morning birdsong and a strange weight across his legs. Opening his eyes to the clear dawn, Jamal found himself lying in soaked straw, his ruined guitar beside him, and Thunder's massive head resting across his thighs. The horse's body curled protectively around him like a living barrier against the world. For several minutes, Jamal didn't dare move, hardly dared breathe. Thunder's eyes were half closed, his breathing deep and even. Somehow, in the chaos of the storm, a fundamental barrier had been crossed. The Mustang that had attacked 3 professional trainers was now sleeping beside him, vulnerable and trusting. "Thank you," Jamal whispered, his voice rough from hours of singing against the storm. Thunder's ear flicked at the sound, but he didn't raise his head. News of this development spread quickly, particularly among the small African-American community of Oak Ridge. The first to appear at Jamal's gate was Eleanor Washington, a slender, dignified woman of 78, widow of Dr. James Washington, who had been the first black veterinarian in the county. Eleanor was respected even by those who would never have invited her into their homes. She stood silently for nearly 30 minutes, watching as Thunder grazed at one end of the yard, while Jamal fixed a broken section of fence at the other. The horse never took his eyes off the young man, tracking his every movement with alert attention. "May I come in?" Eleanor finally called. Jamal looked up, surprised. He knew Eleanor by reputation but had never spoken to her. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, opening the gate carefully to ensure Thunder wouldn't bolt. Eleanor entered with graceful confidence, seeming unconcerned by the notorious horse. She watched their interaction for several more minutes before speaking again. "My husband used to say there are 2 kinds of people with animals," she said finally. "Those who want to bend their will and those who know how to listen. You're the second kind, young man." Jamal ducked his head, unused to praise. "Just trying to help him, Mrs. Washington." "Eleanor," she corrected. "And I can see that. What I see more clearly is that he's already helping you." The rising sun illuminated the raindrops still clinging to Thunder's black coat as Eleanor Washington paused at the gate before leaving, observing the unlikely tableau for long minutes before murmuring, "My husband was right all along. There's magic in this world that rich folks with all their fancy equipment will never understand." Eleanor Washington returned the following afternoon, this time with purpose in her measured stride. She found Jamal repairing his guitar, carefully gluing a crack in the body where the rain had warped the wood. Thunder stood nearby, closer than he'd been just days before, watching the young man's hands with curious attention. "That instrument's seen better days," Eleanor observed, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a lifetime educator. Jamal looked up, surprised by her return. "Yes, ma'am, Eleanor, but it still has music in it." She nodded as if he'd confirmed something important. "I've been thinking about you and your friend here," she said, nodding toward Thunder. "This yard isn't much room for a horse that size, especially one that needs to remember what freedom feels like." Jamal's shoulders tensed slightly. "I know it's not ideal. I'm saving up for something better, but I have 5 acres sitting empty," Eleanor interrupted, her tone matter of fact. "My place on Willow Creek Road. There's a good pasture that hasn't seen a horse since my honey died 3 years ago. The old stable needs work, but it's solid." Jamal stared at her, unable to fully process what she was offering. "I can't afford to rent land right now, ma'am." Eleanor waved away his concerns with an elegant hand. "Who said anything about rent? James and I never had children. What I have goes unused." She studied Thunder with careful eyes. "That horse needs space to run if he's ever going to heal properly." "Why would you do this?" Jamal asked, genuinely puzzled by such generosity from someone who barely knew him. Eleanor's gaze was direct, unflinching. "My husband spent 40 years treating animals in this county. The rich folks called him for emergencies when no white vet was available, then forgot his name afterward." Her eyes softened as she watched Thunder. James could always tell which animals had been mistreated, said they carried it in their eyes, just like people do. He'd have seen something special in how this horse looks at you. The move to Eleanor's property happened 2 days later. Pastor Jenkins from the Mount Olive Baptist Church arrived early in his weathered pickup truck to transport Jamal's few belongings. Thunder followed behind, led by Jamal on foot, maintaining a distance that felt respectful rather than fearful now. Eleanor's property sat 2 miles outside town, a modest white farmhouse surrounded by maple trees and well-maintained fences. Behind the house stretched 5 acres of gently rolling pasture, bordered on one side by a line of sycamores that followed the curve of Willow Creek. "It was just enough land for James to have his practice, and for me to keep a few animals," Eleanor explained as they approached. "Nothing fancy like Ashford's place, but it's paid for, and it's ours. Mine now." Thunder hesitated at the entrance to the property, nostrils flaring as he processed the new smells. Jamal waited patiently, neither pulling forward nor urging the horse on. "This is home now," he said quietly. "Better than anything either of us has had in a while." After several tense minutes, Thunder stepped forward, following Jamal up the gravel drive. Eleanor led them past the house to the pasture where a small stable stood, weathered but sturdy. "Needs a good cleaning," she said, pushing open the barn door. "But the roof doesn't leak." For the first time, Thunder was released into a space large enough to run. Jamal slipped the lead rope from around the horse's neck and stepped back, giving him complete freedom. Thunder stood frozen for a moment, as if disbelieving the sudden absence of restraint. Then, with a soft snort, he took one tentative step forward, then another. Watching from the fence, Jamal and Eleanor observed as Thunder's exploratory walk became a trot. Then finally, as he reached the far side of the pasture, a full gallop. Powerful, fluid, magnificent in his natural movement. For a few breathtaking moments, the scarred, traumatized animal transformed into what he was meant to be. Pure, elemental freedom in motion. "Would you look at that?" Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's what healing begins to look like." Jamal couldn't speak, his throat tight with a complicated mixture of joy and sadness. Joy at seeing Thunder experience freedom, sadness at understanding just how much had been stolen from this magnificent creature. The following days established a new rhythm. Each morning, Jamal would leave on his bicycle before dawn for whatever work he could find, returning by late afternoon. Eleanor, despite her age, proved to be a formidable ally, introducing Jamal to the extensive veterinary library her husband had maintained and the detailed journals he had kept throughout his practice. "James believed in documenting everything," she explained one evening, showing Jamal a leather-bound journal. "Said the establishment would try to erase our contributions if we didn't write them down ourselves." The journals contained decades of observations about treating traumatized animals, detailed notes on healing techniques that combined modern veterinary medicine with traditional remedies passed down through generations of black healers in Kentucky. Each night, Jamal read by lamplight, absorbing knowledge about healing both physical and psychological wounds. During the day, Eleanor often sat on her porch, watching as Thunder gradually explored his new environment, gaining confidence daily. She kept a small notebook, jotting observations about the horse's behavior and Jamal's methods. "You never try to force him," she noted one afternoon as Jamal sat cross-legged in the pasture, a red apple on his palm, waiting for Thunder to approach. Most men would have tried to put a halter on him by now. "He's had enough of being forced," Jamal replied, remaining perfectly still as Thunder circled at a distance, eyeing the apple. "I figure we've got time." The support from the small black community of Oak Ridge materialized in unexpected ways. Pastor Jenkins appeared regularly, his truck loaded with extra hay that the church supposedly couldn't use. Mrs. Josephine, who cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods, began bringing buckets of high-quality feed. "They throw out more in a day than you could use in a week," she said, handing over oats clearly marked with the logo of an expensive equestrian supplier. "Might as well go to a horse that needs it." As Thunder's physical condition improved, his coat regaining its shine, his ribs less prominent, Jamal focused on healing the invisible wounds. Each day he moved his point of contact a little closer, offering food from his open palm, speaking constantly in a low, melodic voice about everything and nothing. "I think you understand when I talk about the places where they hurt me," he said one evening as Thunder finally allowed him to stroke his neck lightly, fingers gentle over the ridge of scar tissue left by a too-tight collar. "You know how it feels to want to run and not be able to. You know what it's like when trusting seems impossible." On the scarred back and flanks of the animal, Eleanor taught Jamal to apply homemade salves, recipes her husband had developed combining conventional medicine with traditional herbal knowledge. "This will help the tissue heal," she instructed, showing him how to warm the mixture in his hands before applying it. "But it's your touch that's teaching him not all human contact means pain." The confrontation they had both anticipated came on a golden afternoon in late spring. 3 vehicles pulled up Eleanor's driveway in a cloud of dust. Douglas Ashford's luxury pickup truck, followed by 2 other expensive vehicles carrying local farmers known to be in Ashford's social circle. Eleanor and Jamal watched from the porch as the men emerged, Ashford leading with the confident stride of someone unused to being denied access anywhere. "Afternoon, Mrs. Washington," he called with false joviality. "Hope you don't mind us stopping by. Heard you'd taken in our young horse enthusiast here." His eyes slid dismissively over Jamal. "Thought we'd check on the progress of his investment." "My property, my guests," Eleanor replied coolly. "What brings you all this way, Mr. Ashford?" Ashford gestured toward the pasture where Thunder grazed at a distance. "Professional curiosity. That horse put one of my trainers in the hospital. Broke another's arm. Just wanted to see what miracle the boys worked." The condescension in his tone made Jamal's jaw tighten, but he remained silent, aware that this confrontation was inevitable. Ashford's ego wouldn't allow Jamal's success to go unchallenged. "Then, by all means," Eleanor said, stepping aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Observe away." The group moved toward the fence, the farmers hanging back slightly, exchanging knowing glances that suggested they expected entertainment at Jamal's expense. Thunder, sensing the newcomers, raised his head and retreated to the far end of the pasture. "So, boy," Ashford called loudly. "Managed to get a rope on him yet? Or are you just feeding him to death with this hippie nonsense?" Jamal remained calm, years of navigating white hostility having taught him to maintain his composure. He looked toward Thunder, who was watching the gathering with alert wariness, then back to Ashford. Without speaking, Jamal made a soft sound with his tongue. Not a whistle or a call, just a gentle click that had, over the weeks, become their private code. To the astonishment of everyone, including Eleanor, who watched from the porch, Thunder immediately raised his head, looked directly at Jamal, and began trotting toward him. The Mustang stopped a few feet from where Jamal stood, lowered his magnificent head, and allowed, for the first time in front of witnesses, Jamal to stroke his muzzle, neck, and back without showing any sign of fear or aggression. Then, in a gesture that left the observers speechless, Thunder gracefully folded his front legs and lay down beside Jamal, resting his head in the young man's lap like an enormous dog. "Impossible," murmured one of the farmers. "That horse attacked 3 professional trainers." "What did you do to him?" asked Ashford, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. Jamal looked up for the first time, meeting the rich man's gaze directly. "I didn't do anything to him, Mr. Ashford. I did something with him. There's a difference." The distinction hung in the air, profound in its simplicity. Eleanor smiled from the porch, recognizing in Jamal's words the same philosophy her husband had lived by, that healing came from partnership, not domination. "Impossible," muttered one of the farmers as Thunder lay peacefully beside Jamal like a giant dog. "That horse attacked 3 professional trainers." Ashford, his face red with humiliation, shot a venomous glare at Jamal before storming back to his pickup. "This isn't over, boy." Words that sounded like a promise, not an empty threat. Ashford's tires sprayed gravel as he accelerated down Eleanor's driveway, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the still spring air. Jamal remained beside Thunder, one hand resting on the horse's muscular shoulder, feeling the slight tremors that ran through the animal's body, a physical echo of the threat they'd both recognized in Ashford's parting words. "He doesn't take losing well," Eleanor observed as she approached them. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed concern. "Never has, according to James." Thunder rose smoothly to his feet, his body language alert but no longer fearful. The transformation in just these few weeks was remarkable. His coat had begun to regain its natural sheen, and though the scars across his flanks remained visible, the raw anger in his eyes had softened into something more measured, more knowing. "We'll be okay," Jamal said, more to convince himself than Eleanor. But even as the words left his mouth, a cold certainty settled in his stomach. Men like Douglas Ashford didn't make idle threats. The first consequence of Ashford's wounded pride arrived the very next morning. Jamal pedaled to the Wilson farm where he'd been working 3 days a week, only to find Mr. Wilson waiting uncomfortably by the gate, hat in hands. "Sorry, son," the older man said, eyes not quite meeting Jamal's. "Don't need the extra help anymore. Things are slowing down." Jamal nodded, recognizing the lie but knowing better than to challenge it. The Wilsons sold most of their produce to Ashford's country club and restaurants. "I understand, sir. Thank you for the work you've given me." The pattern repeated itself throughout the week. Doors that had previously been open, if just barely, now closed firmly in his face. The Hanson farm, the Murphy orchard, even old Mrs. Becker, who needed her lawn mowed, all suddenly found reasons why they no longer required Jamal's services. Returning to Eleanor's on the 3rd day of rejections, Jamal found an official-looking car parked in the driveway. A thin man in a county uniform was examining the stable, clipboard in hand, while Eleanor stood nearby, arms crossed and expression stormy. "Ah, Mr. Williams," the man said as Jamal approached. "I'm Frank Dawson, County Animal Welfare Inspector. We've received anonymous complaints about the conditions in which you're keeping a potentially dangerous animal." Eleanor stepped forward. "I've already told Mr. Dawson that this is private property, and any animal here is being kept under optimal conditions." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I respect your position in the community, but I have to follow procedure when complaints are filed." "Interesting how these procedures never seem to apply to certain properties," Eleanor replied, her tone cutting. "I don't recall seeing you inspect the Ashford Correction Barn, despite the rumors that have circulated for years." The inspector's face reddened. "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Washington." "And who exactly filed these complaints?" Jamal asked quietly. "Anonymous, as I said," Dawson replied, not meeting his eyes. "But 3 separate calls, which triggers a mandatory inspection." 3 calls, 3 of Ashford's cronies, most likely. Jamal nodded and gestured toward the pasture where Thunder grazed peacefully. "You're welcome to inspect whatever you need to, sir. We have nothing to hide." The inspection revealed what Jamal already knew. The stable needed work to meet county codes, particularly regarding drainage and certain safety features. Dawson left them with a list of required improvements and a deadline of 2 weeks to comply. "This is how it begins," Eleanor said as they watched the inspector's car disappear down the drive. "Death by 1,000 paper cuts." James faced the same tactics when he first opened his practice. The next blow came the following day when Jamal's landlord, Mr. Finch, appeared at Eleanor's with an apologetic expression but firm message. Jamal's rent was increasing by 50%, effective immediately. Property values are going up, Finch explained, unable to look directly at Jamal. Just business, nothing personal. After he left, Jamal calculated his dwindling savings against the new rent amount and the stable improvements required by the county. The math was brutally simple. He couldn't afford both. Something would have to give. "You'll stay here," Eleanor declared when he shared his predicament. "The back bedroom has been empty since James passed. No sense in paying rent elsewhere when I have space gathering dust." Jamal started to protest, but Eleanor raised a hand to silence him. James always said pride is expensive luxury for those with limited resources. Accept help when it's offered honestly, young man. That weekend, something unexpected happened. Pastor Jenkins arrived with 6 men from Mount Olive Baptist Church, truck beds loaded with lumber, tools, and roofing materials. "Heard you might need some help with barn improvements," he said simply. "Church community project. We do them every month." Throughout the day, more people arrived. Women from the church brought food. Teenagers helped clear debris. By sunset, the stable had a new roof, proper drainage, and reinforced walls that exceeded county requirements. As Jamal thanked everyone, Pastor Jenkins shook his head. "We take care of our own," he said quietly. "Always have, even when it had to be invisible to others." The story of Thunder's remarkable recovery was spreading beyond their immediate circle. One afternoon, a young white woman with a camera and notepad appeared at the gate. "Sarah Bennett, Oak Ridge County Chronicle," she introduced herself. "I've been hearing interesting things about a miracle with an untamable horse. Would you be willing to show me?" Eleanor studied her carefully before responding. "And what kind of story are you looking to write, Ms. Bennett?" "An honest one," Sarah replied. "About connection and healing, if what I've heard is true." After a thoughtful pause, Eleanor nodded her permission, and Jamal led Sarah to the pasture fence. Thunder was at the far end, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "Could you call him over?" Sarah asked, camera ready. Jamal smiled slightly. "He's not a dog. He comes when he chooses to." Nevertheless, he made the soft clicking sound that had become their signal. Thunder's head lifted immediately, ears forward, eyes focusing on Jamal with unmistakable recognition. Without hesitation, the horse began moving toward them, his gait smooth and deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the fence, regarding Sarah with cautious interest. "He's magnificent," she breathed, snapping photos. "The scars, are those from Ashford's training methods?" Jamal nodded. Thunder was wild-caught. Those methods might work on domestically raised horses, but not on one who knew freedom. Over the next hour, Sarah documented how Thunder now responded to Jamal's whispered commands, following him without any physical restraint, allowing his touch without flinching. The connection between them was palpable, a silent conversation of mutual trust that needed no translation. "It's extraordinary," Sarah said as she prepared to leave. "He looks at you like he sees me," Jamal finished. "Not what I can do for him, or what I might take from him, just me." 3 days later, the Oak Ridge County Chronicle featured a front-page article titled "The Enchanter and the Untamable Horse," with photos of Jamal and Thunder that captured their remarkable bond. Sarah's piece questioned conventional training methods and subtly highlighted the contrast between Ashford's force-based approach and Jamal's patient-centered techniques. The article brought curious visitors to Eleanor's gate, some supportive, others skeptical, all wanting to witness the miracle for themselves. Jamal accommodated them at a distance, never pushing Thunder to perform, but allowing people to observe their natural interaction. "You've become quite the local celebrity," Eleanor observed one evening as they sat on her porch. "James would have loved this, evidence that his methods were right all along." Jamal smiled, but his joy was short-lived. The following morning he found Thunder lying in the pasture, his powerful body contorted in obvious pain, sides heaving with labored breathing. "Something's wrong," he called to Eleanor, who was already hurrying toward them, alerted by the distress in Jamal's voice. Thunder's eyes were wild with pain, his muscles spasming beneath Jamal's touch. Eleanor examined him quickly, her movements efficient despite her age. "Call Dr. Winters," she instructed, referring to the local veterinarian. "Tell him it's an emergency." Dr. Winters arrived within the hour, his examination thorough but ultimately inconclusive. "These symptoms don't match typical colic," he said, perplexed. "The muscle spasms, the neurological signs, I've never seen this combination before." "Could it be poison?" Eleanor asked directly. The vet hesitated. "Possibly. Some toxins can cause these symptoms, but I'd need to run tests to confirm." While the vet drew blood samples, Eleanor began her own investigation. Walking the perimeter of the pasture, she found what she was looking for near the back fence: trampled grass and cigarette butts that hadn't been there the previous day. "Someone was here last night," she told Jamal when she returned, "and they didn't come to admire the horse." That night began Jamal's vigil. He refused to leave Thunder's side, sleeping in the stable on a makeshift bed of hay, singing softly whenever the horse experienced particularly violent spasms. Eleanor worked alongside him, preparing remedies from her garden that she combined with the medications Dr. Winters had left. "My husband always said modern medicine works faster when paired with ancient knowledge," she explained, showing Jamal how to administer the herbal tinctures. These plants were healing animals long before pharmaceutical companies existed. For 3 days and nights, Jamal barely slept, his world narrowing to Thunder's labored breathing and the constant battle against pain. He spoke continuously to the suffering animal, sharing stories of his own life, his dreams, his fears, the confessions flowing more freely in the quiet sanctuary of their shared struggle. "I know what it's like to want to give up," he whispered during a particularly bad spell when Thunder's eyes rolled back in agony. "I've been there too. But we're fighters, you and me. We don't quit just because it would be easier." On the dawn of the 4th day, Thunder struggled to his feet for the first time since falling ill, weak and unsteady, but standing. He turned his head toward Jamal, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion beside him, and gently nudged the young man's shoulder with his muzzle. Jamal awoke instantly, his exhausted face breaking into a smile of pure relief. "Hey there, fighter," he whispered, rising to stroke Thunder's neck. "Welcome back." Eleanor, who had been watching from the stable door, wiped tears from her eyes before speaking. "That horse didn't just survive for himself," she said. "He fought to come back to you." As Thunder gradually regained his strength over the next few days, Sarah Bennett returned, her expression grave as she requested to speak with Jamal privately. "We need to talk," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I have information from a reliable source at the county clerk's office. Ashford has petitioned to enforce an old municipal ordinance about dangerous animals in residential areas. He's legally trying to force Thunder's removal or destruction." Sarah's words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jamal felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the journalist explained further. "It's an obscure law from 1952, she said, pulling a photocopy from her messenger bag. "It allows for animals deemed dangerous to public safety to be forcibly removed or euthanized if 3 formal complaints are filed." Eleanor, who had approached silently, took the document with steady hands. Her eyes scanned the faded text, recognition dawning on her face. "I remember when this was passed," she said softly. "James was outraged. It wasn't about public safety. It was about control." Jamal looked toward the pasture where Thunder was recovering, still weak but grazing with newfound determination. "How many complaints has Ashford filed?" 2 already, Sarah confirmed, both from his employees claiming they felt threatened when passing by the property. She hesitated before adding, "My source says he only needs 1 more before the county is obligated to act." Eleanor's living room became their war room that evening. Sarah spread her research across the antique coffee table, similar cases from county records, precedents, and the history of the ordinance's enforcement. This law was almost exclusively used against black families after the Oak Ridge riots in 1950, Eleanor explained, retrieving one of her husband's journals. James kept records. 27 dogs owned by black families were destroyed under this ordinance. Only 3 belonging to white families. Jamal's hands clenched involuntarily. So it's always been a tool, not just a law. "Every law is a tool," Eleanor replied. "The question is who wields it, and against whom?" Sarah's articles began appearing daily in the Chronicle, meticulously documenting Thunder's transformation and subtly questioning Ashford's motives. "When a wild horse threatens the status quo," read one headline, accompanied by a photo of Thunder peacefully grazing beside Jamal. Public interest grew. Letters to the editor debated the case, with longtime residents recalling how the dangerous animal ordinance had been selectively enforced throughout the town's history. The pressure from Ashford intensified. A county official arrived with a formal notification. 2 complaints had been registered, with a third to trigger mandatory action. The man seemed uncomfortable delivering the news, his eyes never meeting Jamal's. "Just doing my job," he muttered before hurrying back to his vehicle. Knights found Jamal in the stable with Thunder, speaking softly about their shared predicament. The horse seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, standing protectively closer to Jamal than ever before. "We're not giving up," Jamal promised, running his hand along Thunder's neck where the scars were beginning to fade. "They tried to break you once. They tried to break me my whole life. Didn't work then. Won't work now." During the days, Jamal immersed himself in legal research, borrowing books from the county library and studying late into the night. Eleanor found him one morning, asleep at her kitchen table, surrounded by open volumes on animal law and property rights. "Knowledge is power," she said when he apologized for the mess. "But you'll need more than books for this fight." Help arrived unexpectedly one afternoon in the form of Marcus Johnson, a 72-year-old retired attorney who had fought civil rights cases across Kentucky for decades before his retirement. "Read about your situation in the Chronicle," he said, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick as he surveyed Thunder from the fence line. "Some battles are worth coming out of retirement for." Marcus's legal strategy was multi-pronged. While preparing to challenge the ordinance's constitutionality, he also focused on demonstrating that Thunder posed no public threat, making the law inapplicable regardless of complaints. "We need to change the narrative," he explained during an evening strategy session. "Ashford wants Thunder portrayed as dangerous. We need to show he's not just safe, he's extraordinary." The Mount Olive Baptist congregation mobilized, creating a petition that gathered hundreds of signatures opposing the application of the ordinance. Pastor Jenkins personally delivered it to the county clerk's office, ensuring that the growing public support was officially documented. "This isn't just about one horse and one young man anymore," the pastor told reporters waiting outside. "This is about who gets to decide what's dangerous in our community." As the date for the county assessment approached, Jamal intensified his work with Thunder. They practiced responding to voice commands, maintaining calm in the presence of strangers, demonstrating the transformation from dangerous animal to responsive companion. "He's not performing tricks," Jamal explained to Marcus as they prepared. "He's showing who he really is when he's not afraid." The day of inspection dawned clear and warm. County officials arrived, clipboards in hand, their expressions professionally neutral. A small crowd had gathered, supporters from the church, curious neighbors, and several reporters, including Sarah, who documented everything. Thunder stood calmly beside Jamal as the inspection began. When asked to demonstrate control, Jamal simply whispered commands that Thunder followed without hesitation, walking, stopping, turning, all without physical restraint of any kind. The chief inspector, a balding man who had clearly expected to document dangerous behavior, looked genuinely perplexed. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "This doesn't look like a dangerous animal to me." For a moment it seemed they had won. The officials departed without taking action, promising to review the situation thoroughly. The small crowd of supporters celebrated, Pastor Jenkins leading an impromptu prayer of thanks. Their victory was short-lived. The following morning, a sleek black car pulled into Eleanor's driveway. A man in an expensive suit emerged, introducing himself as James Harrington, Chief Counsel for Ashford Enterprises. "Mr. Ashford would like to resolve this situation amicably," he announced, opening his leather portfolio. "He's prepared to offer $10,000 for the horse, 10 times what Mr. Williams paid." Eleanor's living room fell silent. $10,000 was more money than Jamal had ever possessed. It could fund his animal sanctuary dream, secure his future. The lawyer knew it too, watching Jamal's expression carefully. "Mr. Ashford recognizes your attachment," Harrington continued, "but feels this generous offer acknowledges your effort while resolving the ongoing legal concerns." "What legal concerns?" Marcus asked sharply. "The inspection found no basis for declaring the horse dangerous." Harrington smiled thinly, extracting another document. "This concerns the original sale. Our records indicate the transaction was informally recorded. Without proper documentation, ownership remains legally questionable." The document he presented showed the stable records from Ashford Ranch, with Thunder's sale marked as temporary release, not a permanent transfer of ownership. "This is manipulation," Marcus said after Harrington departed, leaving the offer on the table, "creating doubt about ownership to force a friendly sale." That evening, Jamal sat alone with Thunder under the stars, the horse's massive head resting comfortably against his shoulder. The bond between them had deepened beyond what words could express, a silent communion of two beings who recognized in each other something essential. "I won't sell you," Jamal whispered fiercely. "Not for 10,000, not for 1,000,000. Money doesn't buy freedom. We both know that." Thunder's ear flicked at his voice, the horse's dark eye reflecting starlight, as he gazed at the young man who had shown him that not all humans brought pain. An emergency meeting convened the next day in Eleanor's dining room. Marcus, Sarah, Pastor Jenkins, and several community leaders gathered around the antique table to discuss strategy. "This is classic legal maneuvering," Marcus explained, examining the documents. "Create confusion about ownership, then offer a settlement that seems generous but actually concedes your fundamental right." "Can they prove the sale wasn't legitimate?" Sarah asked. Marcus sighed. "Without a formal bill of sale, it becomes a matter of testimony. Your word against Ashford's employees who now conveniently don't recall witnessing any sale." Pastor Jenkins leaned forward. "So what can we do?" "We fight," Eleanor said simply, "on every front available." Their multi-pronged approach took shape. Sarah would continue publicizing the case, focusing on the bond between Jamal and Thunder. The church community would maintain visible support. Marcus would prepare legal countermeasures, challenging both the dangerous animal ordinance and the ownership dispute. "And I'll continue working with Thunder," Jamal added. "Every day he gets stronger, calmer. The more people see him, the harder it gets to call him dangerous." The community rallied around them. Donations appeared. Feed for Thunder, legal research materials, even a proper saddle, though Jamal still chose not to ride him. Children from the church brought drawings of the miracle horse, which Eleanor proudly displayed on her refrigerator. Each evening, Jamal documented Thunder's progress in a journal Eleanor had given him. Evidence, she called it, of a different way of healing. For a breathtaking week, it seemed their strategy was working. Public opinion shifted noticeably, with letters supporting Jamal outnumbering critics in the local paper. The county commissioners, sensing political winds, delayed any action on the dangerous animal ordinance pending further study. Then the eve of the municipal hearing arrived, bringing news that shattered their fragile hope. Sarah burst into Eleanor's kitchen, breathless and distraught. "A third complaint was filed this morning," she reported. "An anonymous visitor claiming Thunder nearly attacked them when they were walking past the property." Marcus looked grim. "That triggers mandatory action under the ordinance." "There's more," Sarah continued. "Judge Charles Ashford has been assigned to the case." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles Ashford, Douglas's cousin, had served on the county bench for nearly 4 decades, never once ruling against family interests. "This can't be legal," Jamal protested. "It's a clear conflict of interest." "In a larger jurisdiction, perhaps," Marcus replied wearily. "But here, with only 2 municipal judges, and the other conveniently on vacation." Eleanor's hand came to rest on Jamal's shoulder. "The system was never designed to be fair to people like us, child. It was designed to protect people like the Ashfords." That night, Jamal couldn't sleep. He sat in the stable with Thunder, the horse's rhythmic breathing providing the only comfort in a world suddenly tilted against them. The animal sensed his distress, standing closer than usual, occasionally nudging Jamal's shoulder with his muzzle. "We'll find a way," Jamal promised, though for the first time since rescuing Thunder, uncertainty clouded his voice. The eve of the municipal hearing brought the news they all feared. A third formal complaint had been registered, this time by an anonymous visitor who claimed to have been nearly attacked by Thunder. And even more worrying, the judge assigned to the case was Charles Ashford, Douglas's cousin, known for never deciding against family interests in 4 decades on the county bench. Marcus Johnson drummed his weathered fingers on Eleanor's dining table, his legal pad covered with hasty notes. The evening shadows stretched across the room as the strategy meeting continued well past sunset. "A judge who's literally family with our opponent," Marcus said, shaking his head. "In any proper court, this would be an automatic recusal. But not here," Eleanor stated, her voice steady despite the grim news. "Not in Oak Ridge, where the Ashfords have been making and interpreting the laws for 3 generations." Jamal sat quietly, absorbing the reality of their situation. The third complaint, so conveniently filed, the assignment of Judge Charles Ashford. The pieces fit too neatly to be coincidence. "So, what do we do?" he finally asked. "If we can't win in court?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fire that had fueled decades of civil rights cases. "We change the battleground. If we can't win in Charles Ashford's courtroom, we win in the court of public opinion." Sarah Bennett, who had been taking notes, looked up sharply. "A media strategy." "More than that," Marcus replied. "A full spectacle. We make this case so visible, so public, that even Charles Ashford can't simply dismiss it without consequences." By morning, their plan had taken shape. While Marcus prepared the legal arguments, knowing they would likely fall on deaf ears, Sarah would orchestrate what she called the Thunder Campaign, transforming a local dispute into a symbol of something larger. "I know someone at WKYT in Lexington," she said, scrolling through her phone contacts. "If we can get regional coverage, Ashford won't be able to settle this quietly in his cousin's courtroom." The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving them just 4 days to mobilize. Sarah's first article appeared the next morning, "Justice on Trial, When Power Challenges Healing." The piece framed Thunder's story not as a simple property dispute, but as a symbolic battle between 2 approaches to the world: dominance versus partnership, force versus patience. By that afternoon, a camera crew from the Lexington TV station was setting up in Eleanor's pasture. Jamal, initially uncomfortable with the attention, found his voice when focusing on Thunder's transformation. 3 months ago, he couldn't be touched without trying to kill whoever approached him, Jamal explained as the camera captured Thunder gently taking an apple from his open palm. He wasn't born violent, he was made that way by how he was treated. The reporter, sensing a powerful story, pressed further. "And you had no prior experience training horses?" "I've never trained him," Jamal corrected, looking into the camera with quiet intensity. "I've just shown him he doesn't need to be afraid anymore." The segment aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news, reaching households across central Kentucky. By the next morning, Eleanor's phone was ringing constantly. Other news outlets wanted interviews. Animal behavior specialists from the state university requested permission to document Thunder's case for academic study. "This is precisely what we need," Marcus said when he arrived, carrying a thick folder of legal precedents. "Make it impossible for Charles Ashford to rule against us without everyone seeing exactly what's happening." By Saturday, a small team of veterinary students had arrived, led by Professor Alan Michaels from the Equine Behavior Department. Jamal watched nervously as they conducted standardized behavioral tests, measuring Thunder's responses to various stimuli. "Remarkable," Professor Michaels murmured, as Thunder calmly allowed a stranger to approach within touching distance, something that would have triggered violent defense just weeks earlier. "We've studied rehabilitation of abused horses for years, but this rate of progress is unprecedented." "Will your findings help our case?" Eleanor asked directly. The professor adjusted his glasses. "Science doesn't take sides, Mrs. Washington. But data speaks for itself, and what we're documenting here challenges everything the textbooks say about irredeemable cases." While the academic validation bolstered their position, Ashford's team was mounting a counteroffensive. On Sunday morning, the Chronicle's competitor, the Oak Ridge Register, ran a profile questioning Jamal's background and expertise. The article delved into his history in the foster care system, highlighting reports from former foster parents who described him as troubled and unstable. "They're trying to discredit you," Sarah said when she brought the paper to Eleanor's house. "Make it about your character rather than Thunder's transformation." Jamal stared at the article, his throat tight. The quotes from Mrs. Brenner, his third foster mother, brought back painful memories of being locked in a closet for behavioral issues that were actually panic attacks, a child's response to constant upheaval. That afternoon, while checking feed supplies in town, Jamal came face to face with one of his former foster fathers, Frank Miller, who had taken in Jamal for 8 miserable months when he was 11. Miller, now grayer but with the same perpetual scowl, stood blocking the aisle at the farm supply store. "Saw your picture in the paper," Miller said, his voice carrying so other customers turned to watch. "Still causing trouble, I see." Jamal gripped the feed sack tighter, old instincts of self-protection surging through his body. "Excuse me, Mr. Miller, I need to get by. That high and mighty lawyer and reporter friend of yours should know what you were really like," Miller continued, not moving. "Breaking things, lying, stealing food." "I was starving," Jamal said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "You locked the kitchen at night and counted every cracker in the pantry." A hushed silence fell over the store. Miller's face darkened, but before he could respond, a hand came to rest on Jamal's shoulder. Pastor Jenkins stood beside him, his presence solid and reassuring. "Frank," the pastor said with deceptive mildness, "I believe Jamal asked you to let him pass." The confrontation dissolved, but the encounter left Jamal shaken. That night, he couldn't sleep. Memories he'd worked hard to bury resurfacing like corpses in a flood. Near midnight, he went to the stable, seeking the comfort of Thunder's steady presence. The horse sensed his distress immediately, approaching with unusual solicitude, following Jamal like a shadow as he moved restlessly around the stable. Finally, Jamal sat on a hay bale, and Thunder stood beside him, his large body creating a wall between the young man and the world outside. "They're trying to use who I was against who I am," Jamal whispered, his hand resting on Thunder's warm neck. "Just like they used your fear against you." Thunder lowered his head, pressing his muzzle gently against Jamal's chest in a gesture so tender it brought tears to the young man's eyes. In that moment, Jamal understood something profound. Their healing had never been one-sided. He had saved Thunder, yes, but the horse had saved something in him too. Monday dawned clear and unnaturally warm for spring. The county courthouse, a stolid brick building with pretensions of Greek architecture, was surrounded by an unprecedented crowd. News vans from as far away as Louisville jostled for position. Supporters from Mount Olive Baptist stood in a dignified group on one side of the steps, many holding small signs with messages like "Healing Not Harm" and "Justice for Thunder." On the other side, Ashford's supporters had gathered, wealthy landowners, business associates, and ranch employees, their expressions conveying the confident assurance of people accustomed to the system working in their favor. Inside, the small courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Charles Ashford, a heavier, older version of his cousin with the same cold eyes, surveyed the crowd with poorly concealed annoyance. Douglas Ashford sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, immaculately dressed and radiating confidence. Jamal, wearing the only suit he owned, purchased second-hand for Robert Johnson's funeral years ago, sat beside Marcus, trying to project a calmness he didn't feel. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Ashford took his seat, adjusting his robes with theatrical gravity. The legal arguments unfolded exactly as Marcus had predicted. Ashford's attorney presented expert witnesses who had never actually seen Thunder but testified about the inherently dangerous nature of wild-caught Mustangs and the public safety concerns they represented. They questioned Jamal's qualifications, suggesting his methods were untested and potentially dangerous. Marcus countered with Professor Michaels's preliminary findings and testimonials from visitors who had witnessed Thunder's gentle behavior. His arguments were legally sound, meticulously constructed, and clearly falling on deaf ears as Judge Ashford repeatedly sustained objections from the opposition while overruling Marcus's. By mid-afternoon, the direction of the hearing was painfully obvious. Judge Ashford was systematically excluding their strongest evidence while allowing Ashford's team-wide latitude. Sarah's pen moved furiously across her notepad, documenting every questionable ruling. As their case deteriorated, Marcus implemented the strategy they had planned for exactly this scenario. During cross-examination of a so-called expert who claimed Thunder could revert to violent behavior at any moment, Marcus paused dramatically. "Your Honor," he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room, "since we're speculating about this animal's behavior, I request the court permit a live demonstration of his supposed dangerousness." Judge Ashford frowned. "This is highly irregular, Counselor." "So is having a judge preside over a case involving his own family," Marcus replied evenly, causing a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. "But in the interest of justice, surely seeing the actual animal in question would provide clarity." Trapped by the logic and aware of the reporters present, Judge Ashford reluctantly agreed to a controlled demonstration in the courthouse parking lot. As the proceedings moved outside, the crowd swelled, word spreading rapidly through town that something unprecedented was happening. Jamal had arranged for Thunder to be brought to a field adjacent to the courthouse, where Eleanor waited with him. As the official party approached, Jamal felt a moment of panic. Thunder had never been in such a chaotic environment, surrounded by strangers and noise. The horse sensed the tension immediately, his ears flicking nervously, body tense as cameras flashed and voices rose around them. For a terrifying moment, Jamal feared Thunder might indeed react with the fear-driven aggression of his past, proving Ashford right in the worst possible way. Instead, Jamal closed his eyes briefly, centering himself before approaching Thunder. He spoke softly, not just to the horse but to himself. "They're expecting us to fail. They're counting on fear winning. But we know better, don't we?" The transformation was subtle but profound. As Jamal's own anxiety eased, Thunder's posture gradually relaxed. The young man began to demonstrate their communication system, the soft clicks, the whispered words, the nearly imperceptible hand gestures that guided the horse without force or restraint. Thunder responded perfectly, moving through a series of positions, stopping, starting, turning, all without a halter or lead rope. The crowd fell silent, witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about control and cooperation. The climactic moment came when Jamal, in a decision he hadn't planned, asked a young girl from the church group if she wanted to touch Thunder. Under his careful supervision, the child approached, her small hand extended with an apple slice. Thunder, the horse that had been deemed too dangerous to live just months earlier, lowered his massive head with exquisite gentleness, taking the offering with velvety lips that never touched the child's skin. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment that Sarah would later describe as the perfect visual refutation of everything the Ashford legal team had claimed. But when they returned to the courtroom, Judge Charles Ashford's expression had hardened into something implacable. After minimal deliberation, he delivered his ruling. Based on the technical requirements of the Dangerous Animal Ordinance and the preponderance of expert testimony, Thunder was deemed a public safety risk and ordered to be removed from Eleanor's property within 48 hours. Marcus immediately announced their intention to appeal, but the damage was done. The courthouse steps became a battlefield of competing press conferences, Douglas Ashford smugly declaring victory for public safety, while Marcus eloquently condemned the obvious bias in the proceedings. As protesters formed in front of the courthouse, Douglas Ashford approached Jamal with a cold smile. "You have 48 hours to surrender the animal voluntarily before officials remove him by force," he said quietly, his voice pitched for Jamal's ears only. "Unless some accident happens before then." And in that moment, Looking into the rich man's eyes, Jamal understood that the battle had moved beyond the limits of law. Jamal stared at Douglas Ashford's retreating back, the threat still echoing in his ears. The man's casual mention of an accident had clarified everything. This was no longer about legal ownership or municipal ordinances. It was about power, wounded pride, and a rich man's determination to destroy what he couldn't control. "We need to talk," Marcus said, gently guiding Jamal away from the courthouse steps where reporters still clustered. "Not here." The emergency meeting convened at Eleanor's kitchen table less than an hour later. Pastor Jenkins had joined them, along with Sarah and 3 trusted members of Mount Olive Baptist Church. Thunder stood visible through the window, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun, unaware that his fate was being decided yet again by human voices. 48 hours, Marcus said, spreading legal documents across the wooden surface. "We can file an emergency stay with the circuit court, but Charles Ashford's golf partner sits on that bench," Eleanor finished for him, "and the state appeal would take weeks to be heard." The room fell silent, the weight of institutional reality settling over them. Generations of carefully constructed legal barriers, designed precisely to ensure outcomes like this one, stood in their way. "They'll kill him," Jamal said finally, his voice hollow. "Ashford won't risk Thunder making him look bad again. Once they take him, we'll never get him back alive." Sarah's journalist instincts kicked in. "We could go public with Ashford's threat. His word against mine," Jamal interrupted. "And we know which one carries weight in Oak Ridge." Pastor Jenkins, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Sometimes, when the system is designed against you, you have to step outside it to find justice." All eyes turned to him. "Are you suggesting what I think you are, Pastor?" Eleanor asked, a note of surprise in her voice. The older man nodded slowly. "There's a sanctuary for wild horses in eastern Tennessee, Blue Mountain Refuge. They specialize in cases like Thunder's, horses too traumatized for conventional placement." Jamal's heart began to race. "You mean, take him and go," the pastor said simply. "Tonight. We can continue the legal battle, but Thunder needs to be somewhere safe while we fight." Marcus frowned. "That's technically removing property under legal dispute. The court could consider it theft." "Sometimes laws need breaking before they can be fixed," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly firm. "My husband used to say that." The discussion continued as daylight faded, weighing risks against certainties, legal consequences against moral imperatives. By dusk, the decision was made. Jamal would take Thunder to Blue Mountain Refuge, following old hunting trails through the forests to avoid main roads. Eleanor, Marcus, and Sarah would continue the legal battle, buying time and maintaining the fiction that Thunder remained on the property until the appeal could be heard. As darkness fell, Jamal hastily gathered essentials: water, some food for himself, feed for Thunder, a blanket, and his guitar. His hands trembled as he packed, the enormity of what he was about to do finally hitting him. He was risking everything: potential criminal charges, the end of his dream to build a sanctuary, perhaps even his freedom. Eleanor found him in the stable, zipping his worn backpack with resolute finality. "James would approve," she said softly, startling him. "He always said there are times when conscience must overrule caution." She pressed an envelope into his hand. Inside was $300 in worn bills and a hand-drawn map. "Old trails," she explained. "Used since before the Civil War. Some histories don't make it into books, but they're remembered by those who needed them." Pastor Jenkins arrived shortly after, his ancient pickup truck rumbling quietly into the yard. From the truck bed, he produced a small portable GPS unit. "It's pre-programmed with waypoints," he explained. "Safe houses along the way, people who will help without asking questions." The reality of the community mobilizing around him struck Jamal with unexpected force. All his life, he had learned to stand alone, to expect abandonment. Now, in this moment of greatest risk, he was discovering what it meant to be held by something larger than himself. As midnight approached, the time came for departure. Thunder sensed the unusual activity, his body language alert but no longer showing the panic such disruptions would have caused weeks earlier. Jamal approached him without a lead rope or halter, speaking in the low, even tone that had become their private language. "We have to leave," he explained, as if the horse could understand every word. "It's not safe here anymore. I need you to trust me more than ever." Eleanor embraced Jamal tightly before he left. "My husband always said that sometimes you have to choose which fear to face," she whispered. "The fear of breaking unjust rules, or the fear of living with what happens when you don't." Under the cover of darkness, Jamal and Thunder slipped away from Eleanor's property, following a narrow path that led into the dense Kentucky woods behind her land. The three-quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate by, illuminating the path in patches of silver between the shadow of trees. Thunder followed Jamal without hesitation, something that still amazed him despite their deepening bond. The horse's hooves moved with surprising quietness on the soft forest floor, his massive body navigating between trees with a grace that belied his size. The first night was the most dangerous. They were still too close to Oak Ridge, still within easy reach if anyone discovered their absence before morning. Jamal kept them moving until dawn, consulting the GPS unit by its dim light, grateful for the ancient trails that kept them hidden from roads and houses. When morning broke, they had covered nearly 15 miles. Jamal found the first landmark on Eleanor's map, a moss-covered rock formation that marked the turn toward an abandoned hunter's cabin. There, they rested through the daylight hours, Thunder grazing in a small clearing while Jamal caught a few hours of restless sleep. His dreams were chaotic, Douglas Ashford pursuing them with dogs and guns, Thunder being dragged away while Jamal stood paralyzed, unable to intervene. He woke drenched in sweat despite the cool spring air, immediately reaching out to confirm Thunder's solid presence nearby. The horse had drawn closer while Jamal slept, standing guard just a few feet away, ears constantly moving, scanning for threats. When Jamal sat up, Thunder turned to look at him, and the young man was struck again by how much intelligence lived behind those dark eyes. "You're watching over me now?" Jamal asked softly, managing a weak smile. "Supposed to be the other way around." They traveled only at night, using daylight hours to rest in hidden locations marked on Eleanor's map. The journey was arduous, rough terrain, stream crossings that sometimes required lengthy detours, and the constant vigilance against discovery. Thunder proved remarkably adaptable, following Jamal's lead through challenges that would have sent most domesticated horses into panic. On the third day, while they sheltered in a grove of ancient sycamores, Jamal's phone vibrated with a text from Sarah, the first contact he'd risked since leaving. A publicly searching, offering reward for stolen horse. Be careful. That evening, a spring thunderstorm descended without warning, transforming the forest into a chaotic maze of sound and motion. Months earlier, such conditions would have sent Thunder into uncontrollable panic. Now, though clearly anxious, he stayed close to Jamal, drawing comfort from the young man's steady presence. Huddled beneath a limestone overhang as lightning split the sky, Jamal retrieved his guitar from its protective case. The instrument had barely survived the previous storm. Another soaking might ruin it forever. Yet he knew Thunder needed the familiar comfort of music to counter the storm's chaos. He played softly at first, then with growing confidence as Thunder's initial trembling subsided. The horse stood with his body angled to block the worst of the wind from reaching Jamal, their roles reversed from that first storm they had weathered together. "Look at us," Jamal murmured between songs. "Both running from the same man, both refusing to be what he wants us to be. Maybe that's why we found each other." The storm forced them to delay travel, losing precious hours as they waited for conditions safe enough to navigate the slippery forest paths. By Jamal's calculation, they were still at least 2 days from the Tennessee sanctuary, if they could maintain their pace despite increasingly difficult terrain. What he didn't know was that Douglas Ashford had indeed mobilized resources far beyond what they had anticipated. Professional trackers with hunting dogs were already following their trail, using Thunder's distinctive hoofprints and scattered hair to maintain the scent. The reward: $5,000 for information leading to the recovery of the stolen horse, had motivated others to join the search independently. On the fourth night, Jamal heard the distant baying of hounds carried on the night wind. The sound sent ice through his veins and caused Thunder to freeze mid-step, nostrils flaring, muscles tensed for flight. "Easy," Jamal whispered, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. "We need to move faster, but stay quiet." They diverted from their planned route, wading through a shallow creek for nearly a mile to break the scent trail. The detour cost them time and distance, but the sounds of pursuit gradually faded behind them. The close call sharpened Jamal's awareness of their vulnerability. They were still in Kentucky, still in territory where Ashford's influence extended like an invisible web. Each hour brought new challenges: a fallen tree blocking their path, Thunder developing a slight limp that required careful attention, the GPS unit's battery warning blinking ominously. By the sixth day, exhaustion had become Jamal's constant companion. He had barely slept since their journey began, catching only brief moments of rest while constantly alert for sounds of pursuit. Food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, and Thunder was showing signs of the journey's toll, his coat dull from dust and sweat, his movements less fluid than before. Yet something remarkable had happened during their shared ordeal. The connection between them had deepened beyond what Jamal had thought possible. Thunder now anticipated his decisions, moving in perfect synchronization without verbal commands. When Jamal stumbled from fatigue, the horse would position himself to provide support. When danger threatened, they communicated through the slightest changes in posture and breathing. They had become, in essence, a single organism with two bodies, each compensating for the other's vulnerabilities, each drawing strength from the other's resilience. On the morning of the seventh day, Jamal consulted the GPS with rising hope. They were close now, perhaps only hours from crossing into Tennessee and reaching the sanctuary's boundaries. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine success, to believe they might actually escape Ashford's reach. That was when disaster struck. Emerging from a densely wooded area into what should have been a secluded meadow, they found themselves in a small clearing surrounded by armed men. 3 trucks were parked at the far end, and the distinctive baying of tracking hounds confirmed Jamal's worst fears. "No place to run, boy," called the leader of the hunters, a weathered man in camouflage raising a rope coil menacingly. "Ashford's paying good money for that horse, alive or dead." But before he could take another step, the sound of engines and voices interrupted the moment, and through the trees emerged unexpected figures. Pastor Jenkins leading a group of riders from the black community of Oak Ridge, all determined and with expressions that made it clear they weren't there to negotiate. The standoff in the forest clearing crystallized into a moment of perfect tension. On one side stood the hired hunters, weapons and ropes at the ready, the baying of their hounds cutting through the morning mist. On the other, Pastor Jenkins sat tall on his aging chestnut gelding, flanked by 8 riders from Oak Ridge's black community, their faces set with quiet determination. "This doesn't concern you, preacher," called the lead hunter, a man with a weathered face and cold eyes who kept his rifle casually pointed in Jamal's direction. "We're just retrieving stolen property for Mr. Ashford." Pastor Jenkins guided his horse forward at an unhurried pace, positioning himself between the hunters and Jamal. Despite his 70 years, the minister's back remained straight as a chapel pew, his voice carrying the same resonant authority it held from the pulpit. "Brother," he said, addressing the hunter with deliberate courtesy, "I believe you're mistaken about what's happening here." Thunder stood rigid beside Jamal, his entire body vibrating with tension. The scent of the hunting dogs had triggered his deepest survival instincts, yet remarkably, he hadn't bolted. Instead, he had moved closer to Jamal, nostrils flared, eyes fixed on the hunters, ready to flee or fight depending on what his human companion decided. "These men have guns," Jamal whispered to Thunder, one hand resting lightly on the horse's shoulder, feeling the muscles bunched beneath the dusty coat. "Stay with me. Just stay with me." The lead hunter spat on the ground. "Ashford's paying $5,000 for that horse, and we tracked it fair and square. Back off now, and there won't be trouble." This land, Pastor Jenkins replied, gesturing to the forest around them, belonged to our people before your granddaddy was born, before deeds and county lines, before your laws said who could own what. His voice remained even, almost conversational. We know every tree, every stream, every hidden path. You're tracking with dogs and GPS. We navigate by memories passed down through generations. The riders behind him spread out slightly, a subtle movement that nevertheless communicated their unified purpose. Jamal recognized several faces: Deacon Williams, who taught Sunday school, Mrs. Cooper, who ran the community garden, young Marcus Temple, who worked at the auto shop. Ordinary people transformed into something formidable by their collective resolve. You're outnumbered, one of the hunters pointed out, fingers tightening on his rifle. Perhaps, Pastor Jenkins acknowledged, but you're outmatched on this ground. The impasse stretched for long seconds, broken finally by the lead hunter lowering his weapon slightly. You're making a mistake, he said, his tone shifting from threat to warning. Ashford won't stop. He'll bring in more men, maybe even state police. We're aware of Mr. Ashford's resources, the pastor replied. Now I suggest you gather your dogs and return to town. The boy and his horse have protection. After another tense moment, the hunters began to back toward their vehicles, keeping their eyes on the mounted group. This isn't over, the leader called as they loaded their dogs into cages. Ashford pays well for loyalty. Only when the sound of engines had faded completely did Jamal allow himself to breathe normally again. Thunder remained vigilant beside him, ears constantly moving, processing the complex situation with instincts shaped by both his wild ancestry and recent experiences. Pastor Jenkins dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose knees no longer cooperated fully with his intentions. You all right, son? Jamal nodded, emotion tightening his throat. How did you find us? The older man smiled. Eleanor's map, same one she gave you. These trails have been helping our people find safety for a very long time. The other riders had dismounted as well, forming a loose circle around Jamal and Thunder. Mrs. Cooper approached slowly, respectful of the still alert horse. He's magnificent, she said softly. Looks tired, though. And so do you, child. We've been traveling mostly at night, Jamal explained, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion as the adrenaline began to fade. Trying to stay hidden. Pastor Jenkins nodded toward the rising sun. Daylight's not our friend right now. We need to move. There's a safe place about 2 hours from here where you both can rest properly. As they prepared to continue their journey, Pastor Jenkins explained the larger plan that had formed in their absence. Eleanor, Marcus, and Sarah have organized a network all the way to the sanctuary. Safe houses, lookouts, supplies at strategic points. The Underground Railroad never really disappeared, son. It just waits until it's needed again. Thunder, initially nervous about traveling with the mounted group, gradually relaxed as they moved deeper into the forest. Jamal noticed how the horse studied the other horses, observing their calm acceptance of human guidance. Though still keeping closest to Jamal, Thunder began matching his pace to the group, his survival instincts recognizing the safety of the herd. They traveled through terrain that appeared trackless to Jamal's eyes, yet the riders moved with absolute confidence, following landmarks visible only to those who had been taught to see them. A particular configuration of rocks, a tree growing at an unusual angle, streams that needed to be crossed at specific points. By mid-afternoon, they reached what appeared to be an abandoned barn tucked into a hidden valley. Only when they approached did Jamal notice the carefully maintained roof and the small garden growing behind it. Johnson family has kept this place for generations, Pastor Jenkins explained as an elderly man emerged to greet them. Official records say it was abandoned in 1952. Truth is, it's been a refuge ever since. Inside, the barn had been prepared for their arrival. Fresh hay had been laid down for Thunder, and a cot with clean blankets waited for Jamal. A pot of stew simmered on a small propane stove, the rich aroma making Jamal's stomach clench with sudden hunger. Eat, rest, the old man, who introduced himself simply as Ray, instructed. You're safe here for now. While Jamal ate his first proper meal in days, Pastor Jenkins spread a detailed map across a worn table. We move only at night from here on, he explained, tracing their route with a weathered finger. Ashford has too many connections in these parts. But once you cross into Tennessee, you'll meet friends of ours who will guide you the rest of the way. Thunder, after cautiously investigating the barn, had settled near Jamal's cot, accepting water and feed from Ray with surprising ease. The horse's ability to assess which humans posed threats and which offered safety had sharpened dramatically through their ordeal. As darkness fell, the riders who had accompanied them prepared to return to Oak Ridge. "What about you?" Jamal asked Pastor Jenkins. "Won't Ashford suspect you were involved?" The old minister smiled. "I'll be delivering tomorrow's sermon as scheduled, with 24 witnesses ready to swear I never left town. Ashford isn't the only one who knows how to establish alibis." Left alone with Ray as their guardian, Jamal finally surrendered to exhaustion, falling into the deepest sleep he had experienced since beginning their flight. He woke briefly during the night to find Thunder standing guard near his cot, the horse's body positioned between the door and Jamal, a protective stance that spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved. "You're not just following me anymore," Jamal whispered, reaching out to touch the horse's flank. "We're protecting each other now." Their journey resumed the following night, with Ray guiding them through the most difficult terrain yet, steep ravines and dense undergrowth that would have been impossible to navigate without local knowledge. Throughout it all, Thunder demonstrated remarkable trust, following Jamal through passages so narrow they had to move single file, the horse placing his hooves exactly where Jamal directed. Meanwhile, the story of their flight had captured public attention far beyond what any of them had anticipated. Sarah Bennett's articles, initially published in the local Chronicle, had been picked up by national outlets. "Runaway Horse and His Guardian, a Modern Underground Railroad," read one headline, accompanied by the last photo taken of Jamal and Thunder together at Eleanor's farm. The media attention created both risk and protection. While it made their distinctive appearance more easily recognizable, it also meant that any harm befalling them would trigger immediate scrutiny. Organizations dedicated to animal rights had joined the cause, offering legal support and publicly questioning Ashford's motives and methods. On the 5th night of their journey, they reached the Tennessee border, marked by nothing more than a small creek that would have been unremarkable if not for its significance as a boundary between danger and potential safety. Ray embraced Jamal briefly before turning back, explaining that others would meet them on the Tennessee side by morning. True to his word, dawn revealed 2 riders approaching cautiously through the mist, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked braids and a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to her. They introduced themselves as Marie and David Coleman, descendants of a family that had operated a station on the original Underground Railroad. "Your story has traveled faster than you have," Marie said, offering Jamal a thermos of hot coffee. "There's not a black church in 3 states that isn't praying for you two." David approached Thunder with the practiced ease of someone who understood traumatized animals. "He's in remarkable condition considering what you've been through," he observed. "Most horses would have broken down physically or mentally under this kind of stress." "He's not most horses," Jamal replied simply. The sanctuary lay another day's journey ahead, but their path now followed gentler terrain, with the Colemans guiding them through private properties owned by sympathetic families. At each stop, they found provisions waiting: fresh water, feed for Thunder, food, and brief rest for Jamal. What struck Jamal most profoundly was how this network had mobilized so quickly, yet operated with such practiced efficiency, as if the infrastructure had always existed, just waiting to be activated. Each handoff was conducted with minimal words, maximum precaution, and absolute commitment. "People remember," Marie explained when Jamal expressed his amazement. "Not just in their minds, but in their bones. When you come from people who had to create invisible paths to freedom, that knowledge doesn't disappear just because laws change on paper." As they approached the final stretch to Blue Mountain Refuge, David received a call on his satellite phone, his expression growing serious as he listened. "Ashford's escalated things," he reported after hanging up. "He's convinced some state officials that this is a case of interstate theft. There are roadblocks on all the main routes leading to the sanctuary." But we're not on main routes, Jamal pointed out. Marie nodded grimly. True, but it shows he's not giving up. And he has resources we don't. While the tension of the situation settled over them, Thunder had developed his own method for handling stress. The horse now positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with Jamal at all times, his earlier panic responses replaced by heightened awareness and calculated caution. When sensing danger, rather than fleeing wildly, he now moved closer to Jamal, as if they had developed a shared strategy for survival. As they finally arrived at Blue Mountain Refuge on the 8th day of their journey, they were welcomed not by the quiet sanctuary they had expected, but by a scene of organized chaos. Dozens of supporters had gathered at the entrance, many holding handmade signs with messages of solidarity. News vans lined the approach road, cameras tracking their arrival. "This wasn't the low-profile entrance we planned," David murmured as they surveyed the crowd from a hidden vantage point. "But it might be better protection than secrecy at this point." Lisa Morrison, the sanctuary's director and a veteran of many battles against powerful interests, met them at a side entrance. "Welcome to the Resistance," she said with a tired smile, leading them quickly to a recently prepared stable away from the main buildings. "You're not the first to flee from wealthy men to save innocent lives." Lisa Morrison's words hung in the air between them as she guided Jamal and Thunder toward the private stable. Not the first to flee from wealthy men to save innocent lives. An acknowledgement that their story, while unique in its details, followed an ancient pattern of power and resistance. The sanctuary's main barn lay just beyond a gentle rise, its weathered red paint visible in patches through the morning mist. Around it, several small paddocks housed horses in various stages of recovery, some bearing physical scars similar to Thunder's, others showing only the invisible wounds of trauma in their wary movements and vigilant eyes. "We'll keep you separate from the others for now," Lisa explained, unlocking a stall in the quietest corner of the stable. "Thunder needs time to decompress after what you've both been through." Thunder entered the spacious stall cautiously, nostrils flaring as he processed the unfamiliar scents. His body language had shifted since their arrival, the relative relaxation he'd shown on the final stretch of their journey replaced by renewed vigilance. Too many strangers, too many new sounds and smells. Jamal recognized the signs immediately. Thunder's ears flicking rapidly, the slight tremor in his haunches, the way he positioned himself to keep both Jamal and the exit in his field of vision. "It's okay," Jamal murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "We're safe here." Lisa observed their interaction with professional interest. Most horses who've endured what he has would be completely unmanageable in a new environment like this. The fact that he's anxious but not panicking speaks volumes. "He's learned to trust my assessment of situations," Jamal explained, moving slowly to stand beside Thunder, not touching him yet, but offering his presence as anchor. "If I'm calm, he knows there's no immediate danger." That first night at the sanctuary, Jamal slept on a cot beside Thunder's stall, unwilling to leave the horse alone in unfamiliar surroundings. Through the small stable window, he could see the occasional flash of camera lights as journalists maintained their vigil at the sanctuary's main entrance. Their presence formed a strange kind of protection. Ashford couldn't simply send men to reclaim Thunder without witnesses now. Dawn brought Lisa with a satellite phone and a grave expression. "You need to hear this," she said, handing the device to Jamal. "It's Dalton Reed. He worked as Ashford's stable manager until yesterday." The voice on the line was tense, speaking quickly as if afraid of being overheard. "I've been with Douglas Ashford for 15 years, the man explained without preamble. "Seen him do some questionable things, but what he's planning now." A pause, then. "I quit yesterday after overhearing him with his security consultant. He doesn't just want the horse back. He wants it eliminated, permanently." Jamal's blood ran cold. "What exactly did you hear?" His exact words were, "That horse has become a symbol. As long as it lives, this story never dies. He's sending 2 men tonight. They're not coming to recapture Thunder. They're coming to make sure no one else ever has him." After the call ended, Lisa's expression hardened into something like battlefield resolve. "We've dealt with threats before, but usually not this direct." She made several calls, organizing additional security for the perimeter, alerting local law enforcement about potential trespassers. For Jamal, the threat crystallized something he'd sensed but not fully articulated. Thunder had transcended being merely an animal to become something deeply symbolic, a living embodiment of resistance against domination, of healing against all odds. That symbolism made him both powerful and profoundly vulnerable. That afternoon, while Thunder rested in his stall, Dalton Reed arrived at the sanctuary carrying a small flash drive and haunted eyes. The former stable manager looked nothing like Jamal had imagined, not the cruel enforcer of Ashford's will, but a weathered man in his 50s with calloused hands and deep lines etched around his mouth. "I should have done something sooner," Reed admitted as he handed the flash drive to Lisa. "Watched that horse being broken day after day. Told myself it was just business, just training." On the drive were audio recordings, conversations captured on Reed's phone during meetings at Ashford Ranch. Douglas Ashford's voice came through clearly, first ordering the sanctuary break-in, then escalating to explicit instructions about Thunder. "I don't care how it's done, poison, accident, whatever. Just make sure it can't be traced back to us." Lisa immediately contacted federal authorities. "This crosses state lines and involves conspiracy to commit criminal acts," she explained to Jamal. "Local law enforcement might be in Ashford's pocket, but the feds are a different matter." By nightfall, federal agents had established a perimeter around the sanctuary, hidden from view but present. When two armed men attempted to breach the property through a back service road at 2 in the morning, they were apprehended without incident, their vehicle containing tranquilizer guns, surgical equipment, and chemicals that would leave no trace in a necropsy. The morning news carried footage of the arrests, along with excerpts from Reed's recordings. Ashford's face filled television screens across the country as reporters detailed the escalating saga of the millionaire, the Mustang, and the mission to silence them both. Thunder, oblivious to his central role in a national news story, began showing signs of settling into sanctuary life. His initial hypervigilance had eased somewhat, though he still startled at unexpected sounds and remained wary of anyone except Jamal. Most tellingly, he had begun to show curiosity about the other horses visible from his paddock, watching their interactions with humans, studying their movements with the intense focus that Jamal had come to recognize as Thunder's way of learning. 3 days after their arrival, federal agents returned with warrants for Douglas Ashford's arrest on charges of conspiracy, animal cruelty, and obstruction of justice. The evidence from Reed's recordings, combined with documentation Eleanor had provided about Thunder's original capture, had created a legal tsunami that even Ashford's money and connections couldn't hold back. "It's not just about Thunder anymore," Lisa explained as they watched the news coverage. "The investigation has opened up questions about how Ashford acquired dozens of wild horses from protected federal lands. This could unravel his entire operation." For Thunder, the sanctuary offered new challenges. Having formed such an intense bond with Jamal, he struggled to accept care from other humans. When sanctuary staff attempted to clean his stall or refresh his water, he would retreat to the farthest corner, eyes wide, muscles tensed, not aggressive, but clearly communicating his distrust. "He's made remarkable progress with you," Lisa observed one morning, as Thunder allowed Jamal to apply medication to a small cut on his flank. "But for his long-term rehabilitation, he needs to learn that other humans can be safe too." Jamal understood the logic, but felt an unexpected resistance. His connection with Thunder had become so profound, so personal, that sharing it felt almost like betrayal. Yet he knew Lisa was right. For Thunder to truly heal, he needed to expand his circle of trust beyond just one person. They developed a careful protocol. Jamal would remain present while staff approached, speaking constantly in the low, melodic voice that Thunder associated with safety. Staff would mimic Jamal's movements, slow, deliberate, telegraphing intentions. Progress came in microscopic increments, Thunder allowing Lisa to place his feed bucket without retreating. Thunder permitting the young stable hand named Miguel to stand nearby while Jamal groomed him. Small victories that represented massive shifts in the horse's psychological landscape. A week into their sanctuary stay, Dr. Helen Winters, the refugee's veterinarian, conducted a thorough examination of Thunder with Jamal's assistance. Her findings painted a stark picture of Thunder's history. The scar tissue on his back and flanks shows at least 3 different implements, she explained, pointing to distinct patterns in Thunder's coat. A traditional whip here, something like a riding crop here, and these uniform marks were likely made with an electric prod. Jamal felt physically ill imagining the systematic torture that had been disguised as training. Thunder, sensing his distress, moved closer, offering the same comfort he now regularly received, a remarkable reversal of their initial dynamic. The most telling evidence is in his behavior, Dr. Winters continued. Typical abuse cases show generalized fear of humans. Thunder's responses are more specific. He reacts differently to voices of different pitches, to particular movements, to certain types of equipment. That suggests his trauma was precisely administered, almost methodical. This clinical confirmation of what Jamal had intuited from the beginning solidified his resolve. Whatever happened legally, whatever consequences Ashford faced, Thunder's healing remained the central mission. As the second week at the sanctuary began, Jamal noticed Thunder watching the other horses with increasing interest, particularly during their group therapy sessions, a specialized program where traumatized horses were gradually introduced to each other in controlled settings. Thunder would stand at his paddock fence, ears forward, studying the delicate dance of equine social reintegration. "He's ready," Lisa suggested one morning. "Would you be willing to try him in a small group session?" The initial introduction was carefully orchestrated. 2 of the sanctuary's most stable residents, a gentle Appaloosa mare named Star and an older thoroughbred gelding called Professor, were brought into the round pen. Jamal led Thunder in, staying close but giving him freedom to approach or retreat as he chose. Thunder's response revealed how far he had come. Though initially tense, he displayed none of the panic or aggression that would have been inevitable months earlier. Instead, he circled the perimeter cautiously, maintaining distance but clearly curious. When Professor approached with the characteristic head-lowered greeting of equine social overture, Thunder froze momentarily before tentatively reciprocating the gesture. "That's huge," Lisa whispered from the fence. "He remembers the language of his kind." By the session's end, Thunder had allowed both horses to stand near him, even exchanging brief nose touches with Star, the horseback equivalent of a handshake. He still kept Jamal in sight at all times, but his willingness to engage represented a monumental shift. That evening, as Jamal sat on a hay bale outside Thunder's stall, playing soft blues on his repaired guitar, Lisa joined him with news that altered their trajectory once again. "The federal investigation is expanding," she explained. "They've uncovered documentation linking Ashford to illegal roundups on Shoshone tribal lands dating back 10 years. She hesitated before continuing. "They've asked if Thunder would be available for DNA testing. They believe he might be directly descended from the protected herd that was specifically off-limits to capture operations." The revelation recontextualized everything. Thunder wasn't just any wild Mustang. He was potentially the living evidence of a systematic crime against both federal law and native sovereignty. His existence threatened Ashford not just symbolically, but legally, potentially unraveling a decade of profitable but illegal operations. 5 days after Jamal and Thunder had arrived at the sanctuary, while they were gradually settling into a routine of healing and relative safety, an unfamiliar vehicle approached the main gate. Eleanor Washington emerged, her 78 years seeming to weigh more heavily after the journey, but her eyes bright with purpose as she confronted the federal officers. "I have something you need to see," she announced, holding up an old folder bearing the official seal of Kentucky State. "Original documents my husband kept for decades about Thunder's legal ownership and ancestry, and the true story of how the Shoshone Reservation Mustangs were illegally captured by Ashford's operation 10 years ago." Eleanor's arrival with the weathered folder sent ripples through the sanctuary. Federal agents gathered around as she carefully extracted documents yellowed with age but meticulously preserved, their official seals and signatures still clearly visible after a decade. "My husband was the county veterinarian," she explained, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. He was called to examine horses after the Shoshone roundup. What he found disturbed him deeply. The lead federal agent, a woman named Agent Rivera with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, handled the documents with gloved hands. "These appear to be official veterinary records from 10 years ago," she confirmed, scanning the pages, "and breeding lineage documentation." Jamal stood nearby, one hand resting on Thunder's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the warm hide. The horse remained calm despite the cluster of strangers, his eyes fixed on Jamal's face as if drawing security from the young man's expression. "James documented everything," Eleanor continued. "The horses brought in from that roundup had distinctive markings, particularly the stallions from the Ghost Wind bloodline. They were protected not just by federal law but by specific treaty provisions with the Shoshone Nation." Agent Rivera's expression hardened as she examined a particular document. "This appears to be a falsified transfer permit, with notes about how the actual capture locations were misrepresented." "My husband was threatened when he raised concerns," Eleanor said, her voice dropping slightly. "Anonymous calls at first, then direct warnings from Douglas Ashford himself. We had just bought our house. James had loans from his veterinary practice. We had too much to lose by fighting. The revelation that Thunder might be a direct descendant of the protected Ghost Wind bloodline transformed the legal landscape overnight. By morning, federal agents had obtained emergency orders freezing all of Ashford's assets pending investigation. The DNA testing that had been suggested became an urgent priority, with samples taken gently from Thunder's mane while Jamal kept him calm with soft music and constant reassurance. "This goes beyond one horse now," Lisa explained to Jamal as they watched the federal team depart with their evidence. "If Thunder's DNA matches the protected bloodline, it connects Ashford directly to the illegal roundup. It's not just animal cruelty anymore. It's violation of federal law and tribal sovereignty." 3 days passed in relative calm. Thunder continued his gradual integration with other horses, gaining confidence in small increments. He still startled at sudden movements and remained wary of unfamiliar humans. But the progress was undeniable. Each morning he greeted Jamal with a soft nickering sound that had become their private hello, pressing his forehead against the young man's chest in a gesture of trust that still felt miraculous. On the 4th morning, Jamal woke to urgent voices outside the small cabin where he'd been staying. Lisa stood on the porch with Agent Rivera, both women's expressions grave in the early light. "We've received credible information that Ashford has gone off-grid," Agent Rivera explained without preamble. "His private jet left Kentucky airspace last night, destination unknown. Before leaving, he made several large cash withdrawals and contacted individuals with histories of illegal activities." Jamal felt cold dread pool in his stomach. "You think he's coming here?" "We think he's desperate," Lisa corrected. "The DNA results are due today. If they confirm what we suspect, his entire empire could collapse. Men like Ashford don't accept defeat. They lash out." Security around the sanctuary intensified. Federal agents established checkpoints on approaching roads. Volunteers from neighboring properties formed additional patrols. Thunder sensed the tension, his behavior regressing slightly, more vigilant, less willing to venture far from Jamal's side, ears constantly swiveling to track unfamiliar sounds. "He knows something's wrong," Jamal told Lisa, as they watched Thunder pacing in his paddock. "He can feel it." That night, Jamal decided to sleep in the stable again, unwilling to leave Thunder alone with the threat of danger hanging in the air. The horse's relief was palpable, his nervous pacing ceasing as soon as Jamal settled onto the cot beside his stall. In the quiet darkness, Jamal spoke softly about their journey, about Eleanor's courage, about the growing community that had formed around them. "So many people fighting for us now," he murmured, playing gentle chords on his guitar. "For so long, it was just you and me against the world. Now look at us. We've got an army." Thunder's ears flicked toward the music, his eyes half closed in contentment despite the underlying tension of the day. This had become their ritual, music drawing them both into a shared space where past trauma receded, if only temporarily. Just past midnight, the sanctuary's alarm system blared to life. Thunder reared in terror at the sudden noise, crashing against his stall door. Jamal leapt to his feet, heart pounding as shouts and the beam of flashlights cut through the darkness outside. "Stay with Thunder!" Lisa shouted, appearing at the stable door. "We've got intruders at the south fence!" The chaos that followed unfolded with nightmarish speed. Multiple vehicles had breached the sanctuary's perimeter simultaneously. A coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the security measures. In the confusion, 2 men made it to the stable, forcing the lock with practiced efficiency. Jamal stood protectively in front of Thunder's stall, armed only with a pitchfork he'd grabbed from nearby. "You're not taking him," he stated, his voice steadier than he felt. "Move, kid," one man ordered, raising what looked like a tranquilizer gun. "Ashford just wants what's his." "He was never his," Jamal replied, shifting to maintain his position as the men spread out. What happened next occurred in fragments of chaotic motion. The men rushed forward simultaneously. Jamal swung the pitchfork, connecting with one attacker's shoulder. A sharp pain exploded in his temple as the second man struck him with something heavy. Thunder's terrified scream pierced the air as Jamal fell, consciousness wavering. Through blurred vision, Jamal saw the men struggling to secure Thunder, who fought with frenzied power, striking out with hooves that had once carried him across mountains. The door to the stall splintered under the force of Thunder's panic. In a surge of desperate strength, the horse broke free, trampling one man beneath his hooves as he bolted for the stable exit. "Thunder!" Jamal called. His voice weak as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Thunder's silhouette against the night sky, disappearing into the dense forest that bordered the sanctuary. When Jamal awoke, fluorescent light stung his eyes, and the antiseptic smell of hospital surrounded him. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and an IV line trailed from his arm. Fragments of memory returned: the attack, the pain, Thunder's desperate escape. "Thunder," he whispered, trying to sit up despite the wave of dizziness that followed. "Easy," came a familiar voice as Eleanor's face swam into focus beside his bed. "You have a severe concussion. You need to stay still." "Thunder," Jamal repeated more urgently. "Where is he?" Eleanor's expression told him everything before she spoke. "He ran into the forest during the attack. Search teams have been looking for 3 days, but..." She didn't need to finish. The mountains surrounding the sanctuary encompassed thousands of acres of wilderness. A needle in a haystack would be easier to find. "I need to look for him," Jamal insisted, again trying to rise. "You'll do no such thing," Eleanor stated firmly, placing a gentle but restraining hand on his shoulder. "You can barely stand. The doctors say you're lucky to be alive. That blow could have killed you." Over the next 2 days, Jamal received a steady stream of visitors. Agent Rivera reported that Douglas Ashford had been apprehended attempting to cross into Canada, his desperation making him careless. The DNA results had confirmed their suspicions. Thunder was indeed a direct descendant of the protected Ghost Wind bloodline, his existence living proof of Ashford's illegal operations. "We've filed additional charges," Agent Rivera explained. "The attack on the sanctuary has turned a civil matter into multiple federal crimes. Ashford's empire is crumbling, investors pulling out, partners distancing themselves." But none of this mattered to Jamal. As his strength gradually returned, his focus remained singular: finding Thunder. On the 5th day, against medical advice, he convinced Lisa to drive him back to the sanctuary. "I need to try something," he explained, his voice hoarse with emotion. "He's out there, alone and terrified. He needs to know I'm still here." Lisa, recognizing the depth of his conviction, helped him to the highest point on the sanctuary property, a rocky outcrop overlooking the vast forest where Thunder had disappeared. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I'll be back at dawn," Lisa said, leaving Jamal with a backpack containing water, food, a flashlight, and his guitar. "Are you sure about this?" Jamal nodded, his eyes already scanning the endless trees below. "I'm sure." As darkness fell, Jamal began to play. His fingers, still weak from his hospital stay, fumbled initially on the strings, but gradually found their rhythm. He played the same blues progressions that had first connected him to thunder, music flowing out across the forest like a sonic beacon. Through the night he played, pausing only to sip water and rest his fingers briefly before continuing. The moon tracked across the sky, stars wheeling overhead as his music carried through the still mountain air. Occasionally, he would call Thunder's name, letting his voice join the guitar in their shared language of trust. Dawn arrived with a pale golden light filtering through the trees. Jamal, exhausted beyond measure, his fingers raw and bleeding slightly, played one final song, the melody he had composed during their journey through the Kentucky wilderness. As the last notes faded into the morning air, he lowered his head in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure anymore who he was speaking to, Thunder, himself, or the universe that had brought them together only to separate them again. That's when he heard it, a distant nickering that might have been imagination or echo. Jamal raised his head, suddenly alert despite his exhaustion. There, at the edge of the tree line far below, stood a dark figure, unmistakable even at a distance. "Thunder," Jamal breathed, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile magic had brought the horse back. Slowly, with visible caution, Thunder emerged from the forest. Even from a distance, Jamal could see the cuts and scratches marking his body, evidence of 5 days alone in unforgiving terrain. The horse paused repeatedly as he picked his way up the hillside, alert for danger but drawn inexorably toward the source of the music that had guided him home. When Thunder finally reached the outcrop, he stopped several yards from Jamal, nostrils flaring as he processed the young man's scent, confirming what his eyes told him. Jamal remained seated, guitar across his lap, allowing Thunder to approach on his terms. "I knew you'd find me," Jamal said softly, tears tracking silently down his face. "I knew you'd come back." Thunder closed the final distance between them, lowering his head to touch Jamal's face with his muzzle, the gesture so gentle it barely disturbed the bandages. For several minutes they remained that way, reunited on the mountaintop, two beings who had faced the worst of humanity and somehow found their way back to each other. The reunion between Jamal and Thunder made headlines across the country, their image on the mountaintop captured by a sanctuary volunteer becoming the symbol of their extraordinary journey. 5 years later, the Sunrise Sanctuary stood on land that had once been Ashford Ranch, purchased after Douglas Ashford's conviction and the liquidation of his assets. The sanctuary had become a nationally recognized center for equine therapy, specializing in treating children from the foster care system who found in traumatized horses mirrors of their own experiences. In the main pasture of Sunrise Sanctuary, as the sun set over stables filled with animals once considered lost causes, a newly arrived girl from the foster system approached Thunder cautiously. The magnificent black Mustang, now a mature horse who rarely allowed strangers to touch him, lowered his head gently to the child's height when she extended a trembling hand, as if recognizing a soul that shared his story, and Jamal smiled, seeing the cycle complete. "This is how healing begins," he said softly, "when we discover we are never alone in our pain."